The ship came in too slowly. That was the first thing Admiral Seelan Mar noticed, and because she had spent 19 years watching warships arrive under pressure, she knew when a thing was wrong in a way that mattered. Every vessel that had docked at Carthan Relay in the last 11 years had come in hot. Fast approach, corrective burn, harsh deceleration, a little too much urgency and not quite enough grace. War did that to ships. Even the elegant ones began arriving like frightened animals by the end. This one descended as if time itself had been briefed in advance and instructed not to interfere. Long hull. Pale metal. No decorative lighting. No fleet markings visible from the gallery. It moved with the kind of certainty old predators had in nature documentaries right before something smaller stopped existing. Around Admiral Mar, the relay's upper observation chamber had gone quiet. Below the glass, the docking cradle lights shifted from amber to white as the vessel settled into place without a tremor. No skid. No overburn. No mechanical complaint. It touched the station the way a blade touches a table when the hand holding it already knows where the table ends. Behind Mar, 3 diplomats from the Coalition Council leaned forward almost in unison. One muttered something under his breath in a language she did not speak and did not need translated to understand. Worry had the same shape everywhere. At the far side of the docking bay, General Oren Vale stood with his hands folded behind his back, looking down through the glass with the expression he wore for artillery reports, funerals, and weather briefings. He was human, 53, broad through the shoulders, beginning to go silver at the temples, and so deeply still that younger officers tended to mistake him for passive until he had already decided something that changed their week. Seelan had worked with him for 6 months. She had not yet seen him rush once. The shuttle ramp lowered. The first human down the ramp was not Vale. That was the second thing people noticed. It was a woman in dark field gear with a bag over one shoulder and a case in one hand. Compact. Unhurried. Her hair tied back without ceremony. She stepped into the docking light, glanced once at the overhead beams, once at the maintenance rails along the wall, once at the cargo lifts in the rear corner, and only then looked at the people waiting for her. Not nervous. Not impressed. Just cataloging. The second human followed. Taller. Civilian clothes under a station gray coat, carrying a tablet and 2 paper notebooks. Actual paper. He paused halfway down the ramp to read something on the docking control panel without touching it, then continued walking as if he had confirmed a private theory. Then the third emerged. General Oren Vale. He came down last with no visible escort and no effort spent making the fact significant. He wore a plain dark service coat with no polished metals, no ceremonial cloak, no visible sidearm. The only remarkable thing about him was how unremarkable he appeared in the middle of a room that had been waiting 12 days for Earth to answer. Admiral Seelan Mar straightened without meaning to. Below, the docking bay doors hissed open. The formal reception party entered first. Station aides, coalition delegates, legal observers, 2 tactical clerks, and at the center of them all, Seelan herself descending the side stair toward the deck. By the time she reached the bottom, the humans were already standing where the painted floor line suggested guests were meant to wait. That irritated her more than it should have. Not because they had done anything wrong. Because they had entered the space like people who expected to use it, not be arranged inside it. She stopped 3 meters from them. General Vale, she said. Admiral Mar. No wasted warmth. No coldness either. Just recognition. She glanced at the 2 with him. You brought fewer people than requested. Vale nodded once. You asked for support. Yes. You did not ask the right kind. One of the coalition diplomats behind her shifted hard enough for Fabric to whisper. There it was. The line. Not loud. Not theatrical. But it hit the room with the clean pressure change of a seal breaking. Seelan kept her expression still. This relay, she said, has been under rotational assault for 11 months. We have lost 3 outer stations, 46 escort vessels, and 2 supply lanes we can't reopen without cost projections your Senate would call unreasonable. Vale's face did not change. Good. At least he knew how to listen in a war zone. She continued. The Veyr Dominion has held the coral expanse for 11 years. Their formations do not break. Their response windows remain inside all modeled combat tolerances. Every time we think we have found their limit, they produce a deeper reserve. We did not request a demonstration team, General. We requested military assistance. Vale looked at her for a long moment. Not confrontationally. Like a man checking whether a door was locked before deciding whether conversation or force would get him through it faster. Then he said, Do you want more soldiers in the war, Admiral? The question felt dangerous before she understood why. She answered carefully. I want the war to end. Vale nodded once. All right, he said. That's different. Behind her, someone from the coalition legal office said, General, with respect. Vale ignored him completely. Not rudely. Perfectly. His attention remained on Seelan. Show me your latest battle geometry, he said. All of it. Successful predictions, failed predictions, pattern assumptions, ceasefire habits, withdrawal doctrine, everything you think they are and everything they do when you're sure of it. The civilian beside him, thin, dark-haired, carrying the notebooks, had already pulled out a pencil. The young woman with the field case had moved half a step to the side and was staring at a relay lift motor in the upper left support frame with the kind of concentration usually reserved for snipers and bomb disposal techs. Seelan noticed both things and filed them immediately. You've been here 40 seconds, she said. Vale said, that's enough time to know you're losing correctly. The docking bay went still. One of the coalition diplomats made a small offended sound, but even he did not speak over the sentence. It was too sharp, too precise, too close to something everybody in the room had privately feared. Losing correctly. By doctrine. By proportionality. By coalition law. By every civilized rule that made command feel organized while the front collapsed one measured corridor at a time. Seelan studied Vale's face. No mockery there. Worse. Sincerity. You think our problem is method, she said. I think your problem has a method, he replied. The civilian finally spoke without looking up from his notes. Question, he said. His voice was mild, almost absent-minded. The 90-day ceasefire cycle they maintain. Who proposed it first? Seelan turned slightly. The Dominion did. On year 2. He made a note. Of course they did. The young woman with the case said, still looking at the lift motor, this dock system's compensator is humming wrong. Nobody answered her. She glanced over one shoulder. It's not urgent, she said. Just annoying. Then she went back to listening to the machine with her head tilted slightly to one side. Seelan felt, for the first time since the ship arrived, something colder than irritation move through her. Not fear. Not yet. The beginning of reclassification. These were not reinforcements in the ordinary sense. They had entered the bay and in less than a minute, treated the war as a systems problem, the diplomacy as incomplete data, and the relay itself as an object worth diagnosing because it happened to be nearby. General Vale took one slow step forward. Not enough to crowd. Enough to make the next sentence feel like an offered contract rather than a request. If you want additional uniforms holding a line for 6 more months, I am the wrong answer, he said. If you want someone to help you keep dying in a more technically sophisticated way, I can recommend several excellent committees. Even the civilian looked up at that. Vale went on. But if you want this war to stop being the shape it has been for 11 years? He glanced once toward the observation glass above, where more faces had now gathered behind the station lights. Then take us to your maps. Seelan said nothing for a moment. She had spent 11 months in this relay. She had watched careful officers execute careful plans and lose carefully measured percentages of ships and people to an enemy that behaved with the kind of disciplined predictability tacticians loved right up until it started killing them. The coalition had sent doctrines. Earth had sent 3 people and a sentence sharp enough to be remembered. Behind Vale, the thin civilian closed one notebook and opened the other. The younger woman finally looked away from the lift motor and said, for the record, if nobody fixes that thing, it's going to fail on a rotation you won't enjoy. No one had asked her. No one, Seelan realized, was going to need to. General, she said at last, if this is your version of diplomacy, I would hate to see your battlefield manner. Vale's mouth moved by a fraction. Not a smile. The possibility of one in another life. Admiral, he said, I'm being polite because we haven't started yet. That did it? Not the words. The certainty underneath them. Seelan turned sharply toward the side corridor leading to command briefing. Bring the tactical archive online, she said to her aide. Full engagement history. Coral expanse through current. Restricted layers included. The aide blinked. Admiral, coalition authorization for restricted. Now. He moved. The diplomats behind her began objecting all at once. Protocol, legal visibility, command hierarchy, Earth status as non-coalition adjunct support only, but she let them talk because people like that always needed 10 extra seconds to discover whether anyone important still cared what they thought. General Vale didn't turn toward them. The civilian slid his pencil behind one ear. The young woman hoisted her case and said, You got coffee on this station, or are we doing the war on recycled disappointment? Seelan looked at her. The woman met the look without blinking. What's your name? Seelan asked. Sergeant June Mercer. You always talk like this? Only when I'm trying to seem approachable. The answer was absurd enough that one of the junior tactical clerks behind Seelan made a shocked choking sound that might have become a laugh if fear hadn't strangled it first. Vale said, "Mercer." June lifted one hand. "I'm done. No apology in it. None needed, apparently." Seelan looked from one human to the next. Not a matched team. Not polished. Not ceremonially impressive. And yet the air around them held that strange and specific tension she had only ever felt twice before in war. The sense that a thing had arrived which did not yet have the right category. At the mouth of the command corridor, she stopped and turned back toward them. The relay lights hummed. The diplomats glared. The station crew watched. Somewhere far beyond the hull, 11 years of stalemate still sat in the dark like an old wound everyone had learned to call normal. "Very well," she said. "You asked the question. Come see the answer." Vale fell into step beside her. Not behind. Beside. The civilian followed, already reading his own notes as if he distrusted memory on principle. June Mercer came last, glancing once more up at the faulty lift motor before she left the dock. As they entered the corridor, General Vale said quietly, just loud enough for Seelan to hear, "Admiral." "Yes." "When your people asked Earth for help?" He looked ahead, not at her. "What you really asked for was permission to stop thinking about this as a war." Seelan kept walking. Because she did not yet know whether that sentence was brilliance, arrogance, or the beginning of something much more difficult to survive. And because some part of her, buried under 11 months of proper losses and acceptable retreat calculations, already suspected he might be right. The paperwork arrived that night in a sealed black folder with no insignia on the cover and 3 separate authorization chains embedded in the lock. Admiral Seelan Mar opened it alone in her office. That was deliberate. Not because the coalition required secrecy. The coalition required secrecy about everything, including things that should have been painted on station walls in letters large enough for exhausted mechanics to read from across a docking bay. No, she opened it alone because she wanted one unfiltered look at what Earth had actually sent before other people's reactions began shaping her own. Inside were 13 names. Not 12, as the request form she had filed months earlier had specified. 13. 1 commanding officer. 1 civilian specialist. 11 others attached under a temporary advisory designation so vague it bordered on insolence. The first file belonged to General Oren Vale. Most of it was blacked out. Not selectively. Aggressively. Whole sections vanished under thick dark bars that left only rank changes, deployment windows, and the occasional surviving sentence like fragments of bone and ash. Operational objective achieved ahead of revised estimate. Personnel losses lower than modeled. Recommendation: do not ask for methodology unless prepared to hear it. Seelan turned the page. The second file belonged to Dr. Mara Sen. Civilian Systems Anthropologist, Xenobehavior Analyst, Conflict Translation Specialist. The title line alone made her sit back slightly. Systems Anthropologist. That was not a battlefield role. That was not even a properly military phrase. The coalition had asked for tactical reinforcement, advisory command, mobile infantry support, heavy predictive logistics, anything that could break the Veyr Dominion's endless, immaculate formations into something mortal. Earth had sent a woman who studied behavior as if war were a language problem. Seelan read farther. Mara Sen's file was not blacked out in the same way Vale's was. It was worse. It was intact in structure, but the surviving details were all the wrong ones. Published papers on pre-conflict ritual signaling in fractured states. Advisory role in 3 de-escalation frameworks. Invited and then quietly removed from 2 intergovernmental panels after procedural disagreements. 1 note from a military liaison that read, "Subject repeatedly identifies unseen assumptions in command modeling. Results annoying then useful." Seelan stared at that line for several seconds. Annoying then useful. That, she thought, might be the most honest recommendation any human office had ever written. She turned the page again. Sergeant June Mercer. Age 26. Combat engineering, field improvisation, systems diagnosis, close route insertion, recovery ops. Redactions everywhere. 1 full page had only a single surviving note near the bottom. Secondary ignition event origin remains undetermined. Sergeant Mercer denies involvement. Recommendation: stop asking unless you want the actual answer. Seelan closed her eyes once. Then reopened them and kept reading. The others were no cleaner. Different ages. Different services. Different backgrounds. 1 naval mechanic who had somehow crossed into infiltration work. One logistics officer with a record that kept mentioning supply denial through environmental reinterpretation, whatever that meant. One medic whose field notes had been partially retained because apparently even Earth sensors had not known which parts counted as dangerous. One signal specialist whose file had a 2-page section removed and then, beneath the black bars, one visible final sentence. Classification remains unresolved because standard categories imply consent from reality. Seelan read that twice, then a third time. By the time she reached the 13th file, she realized she had stopped treating the dossier like military personnel review and started treating it like evidence from a scene she had not yet learned how to reconstruct. The 13th name was not attached to any command group. Not formally. It was simply appended. Dr. Priya Niral, Civilian Xenocognitive Biologist, Temporary Embedded Advisory Authority. Her file was the shortest. Also the least reassuring. Not because it was violent. Because it was precise. 6 years of work on enemy cognition under uncertain communication conditions. 3 major papers suppressed for strategic reasons. 1 internal human defense note. Dr. Niral's value is not prediction. It is identifying which prediction frameworks should be discarded before they kill people. Seelan lowered the folder to the desk and stared at the dark wall opposite her office window. Beyond that wall stretched Meridian Relay. Exhausted night crews. Rotating tactical staff. 1,200 civilians pretending the war had not already changed the station's metabolism. And somewhere under all of it, the old coalition belief that conflicts could be managed by procedure if enough careful people sat around enough careful tables. Then Earth had sent 13 names that looked less like a unit and more like a set of specialized tools somebody had gathered in a hurry only after first spending 20 years deciding exactly which tools would be needed when things got bad enough. A soft tone sounded at her door. Enter. Commander Tal Veyr stepped in. Tall, gray-eyed, disciplined, and one of the few officers on the relay whose presence calmed a room instead of tightening it. He held a second slate in one hand. "You're still reading them," he said. Seelan looked up. "You've seen the files?" "Pieces." He stepped closer. "Enough to know Earth did not send us the kind of help coalition doctrine considers polite." "No," Seelan said. "It did not." Tal glanced toward the closed folder. "Should I be reassured?" She thought about June Mercer diagnosing a docking motor by ear before even being assigned quarters. About Oren Vale asking the war's first honest question in under a minute. About a systems anthropologist being treated like battlefield equipment. "No," she said at last. "But I am becoming interested." That drew the faintest shift at the edge of Tal's mouth. "Briefing room in 20, he said. "They asked for full strategic archives. They can have them." He hesitated. "The restricted secondary models as well?" Seelan looked back at the black folder. "That civilian analyst will ask for them in the first 10 minutes. "You think so?" "I think she'll know they exist before we admit they do." Tal absorbed that without visible argument. "Good officer." He turned to go then stopped. "One more thing," he said. "The young sergeant from the dock?" "Mercer." "She found a harmonic instability in maintenance ring C6. Seelan blinked once. "Already?" She corrected it. Then left a note for the engineering crew about 2 others they hadn't noticed yet. Of course she had. Tal added, "Chief engineer says the sound she identified shouldn't have been audible at human range." Seelan closed the folder fully now. "And yet." Tal nodded once and left. For a moment she remained alone in the office with the silent folder and the larger, stranger silence beneath it. Then she stood. Fort Harlan Annex had been built for coalition planning teams, not humans. That became obvious the moment the 13 stepped into the briefing chamber. The chairs were too narrow in the shoulders for some of them and too rigid in the lower back for all of them. The lighting was a little too white. The climate balance leaned cool and dry in a way most station species found comfortable and most humans merely tolerated. And yet the 13 adapted to the room faster than the room adapted to them. General Vale entered first and took the side seat at the long table rather than the head, which immediately changed the geometry of everyone else's attention. Dr. Mara Sen came in carrying 2 tablets and a paper notebook with colored tabs sticking from the edges like warning flags. She sat without ceremony, read the room once, and then placed the notebook exactly parallel to the table's edge as if preparing to conduct surgery on its assumptions. June Mercer arrived late by 90 seconds, not because she had been delayed, but because she had stopped in the corridor to say something to a maintenance crew that made 2 of them run and 1 swear softly into a wrist comm. The rest of the team settled with the same unsettling lack of performance. No swagger. No visible hierarchy reinforcement. No military chest thumping for allied observers. Just a loose economy of movement that made everyone else in the chamber look like they were over-explaining their own bodies. Seelan noticed the coalition observers noticing it too. Good. Let them. She stepped to the central display. The Veyr Dominion has held the coral expanse for 11 years, she began. You've all seen the public models. I'll skip those and move directly to what hasn't helped. That got Vale's attention. So did it get Mara Sen's. Also good. The display shifted through territorial overlays, fleet densities, ceasefire cycles, loss projections, corridor compression, and predictive engagements run through coalition tactical systems for the last 32 months. Mara listened for 3 minutes without speaking. At minute 4 she raised one finger slightly. Seelan stopped. You're showing us response models? Mara said. Not behavior. Tal Veyr, standing off to one side, glanced at Seelan. There it was. Right on time. What's the distinction? Seelan asked. Mara looked up. The distinction, she said, is the difference between what a system does under pressure and what it tells itself it is doing. Silence. Not hostile. Just recalculating. One of the coalition tactical officers near the wall said, with respect, Doctor, the Dominion is a military opponent, not a cultural essay. Mara turned her head toward him. Then why have 11 years of your military answers produced such culturally consistent failure? The officer shut up. Not because he'd been humiliated. Because the question had landed too close to something he had stopped wanting words around. General Vale said nothing. He did not need to. The smallest hint of a line appeared beside his mouth, which Seelan was beginning to suspect counted as approval in human command language. Mara held out one hand. The missing archive, please. Seelan stared at her. You haven't seen the secondary archive. No, Mara said. But you have one. How do you know? Mara gestured vaguely toward the projected models. Because the primary set explains how you keep losing. It does not explain how you kept thinking you were about to stop. A long pause. Then Seelan nodded to Tal. Bring it up. The room changed. Not visibly. Not dramatically. But everyone in it understood that some threshold had just been crossed. Tal loaded the restricted secondary layer. These were the engagements coalition analysts had filed separately because they did not fit the formal models cleanly. Odd delays. Out-of-pattern regrouping. Inexplicable timing shifts. Local morale anomalies. One brief but repeated tightening on Veyr flank spacing before retreats no one had successfully predicted. Mara stood and walked toward the display. For the next 15 minutes she said nothing. Not one word. She only watched. The room watched her watching. June Mercer sat on the edge of a side table, one boot braced against a lower support bar, sharpening a folding blade she absolutely did not need sharpened and somehow making the sound of it feel like part of the room's concentration. At last Mara spoke. They announce retreat before they know they're retreating. Every head in the room turned. Seelan stepped closer to the display. Explain. Mara pointed. These spacing contractions on the left. Here, 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 and here. Her fingers moved fast, precise. 4 minutes before formal break in every engagement where your analysts logged unexpected Veyr collapse after sustained pressure. Tal said, that could be coincidence. No, Mara replied. It could be if it appeared in one doctrine family. It appears in 6. She tapped again. They tighten when uncertainty exceeds model confidence. One coalition observer frowned. That isn't an operational category. No, Mara said. It's a fear category. The room went quiet. Not because the statement was dramatic. Because it was useful. General Vale finally spoke. How long have we had this and not called it what it is? No one answered. No one needed to. Seelan looked from the display to the black folder on the side table where the 13th files sat waiting like an accusation she had not yet fully earned. This, she thought, was why Earth had sent the wrong-shaped team. Not soldiers only. Not scientists only. Not diplomats only. A set of minds built to notice where everyone else had mistaken a system self-description for its real mechanics. Mara turned from the display. Admiral, she said, the war you've been fighting for 11 years is not the war the Veyr believe they are fighting. General Vale stood. And in the exact second he did, Seelan understood with terrible clarity that the room had just moved from briefing into the beginning of a solution. He looked at the display for 4 seconds. Then at Mara. Then back at the tactical map. Well, he said softly, ain't that something? The sentence meant nothing to half the room. To Seelan somehow it meant the next stage had already started. The first sign that the human unit was wrong for ordinary war did not happen in battle. It happened in a maintenance corridor. Carthan Relay had been built in layers over 60 years by 4 species, 3 funding blocks, and whatever compromises engineering always made after politics got tired. It worked. Mostly. But like anything kept alive under wartime strain, it had developed 1,000 little habits of failure. Couplings that hummed before they burned. Pressure doors that closed a fraction too slow. Coolant lines that rattled just below reportable concern. Lift motors that announced their future with sounds only overworked mechanics usually noticed. Sergeant June Mercer noticed them the way other people noticed weather. Admiral Seelan Mar found her 2 hours after the first briefing standing half inside an open wall panel in maintenance ring C6. One boot braced against the lower frame, one shoulder under a cable bundle, and both hands blackened with sealant grease she had absolutely not been authorized to be touching. Chief Engineer Malvek stood 3 paces away staring at her with the expression of a man who had walked into a room expecting equipment and found philosophy. June pulled a tool free, tightened something hidden in the wall and leaned back enough to say, "There. That one stops whining now." Malvek opened and closed his mouth once. Admiral Mar crossed her arms. "Sergeant Mercer." June turned her head slightly and gave a small nod as if finding an admiral in a restricted maintenance access during the middle of unauthorized repairs was perfectly ordinary. "Admiral. Would you like to explain why you are inside my station?" June glanced into the wall cavity again. "Technically I'm inside your wall." Malvek made a strangled sound. Seelan said very evenly, "That was not the part needing clarification." June slid out of the panel, rose, wiped her hands on a cloth that looked like it had once been part of someone's shirt, and gestured toward the exposed assembly. The phase coupling on the gravlift feed was running off frequency by about a quarter tone, she said. "Would have cost you the motor in 2 rotations, maybe less if somebody overloaded the cargo spine." Malvek found his voice. "You cannot hear a quarter phase drift through plated relay walls." June looked at him. "Apparently I can." That answer irritated him on principle. It was not scheduled for inspection. "Yeah," June said. "That's why it was still broken." Silence. Then, because the universe occasionally retained a sense of timing, a maintenance tech farther down the corridor called, "Chief?" Ring C7 just threw a compensator alert. June didn't even look up. "Different pitch," she said. "Same family." Malvek turned slowly toward her. "You knew?" "Sure." "How?" June shrugged. "Heard it while I was fixing this one." Seelan watched both of them and felt the same thing she'd felt in the dock, then again in the briefing room when Dr. Mara Sen had pointed at the hidden retreat contraction in the Veyr formations. Not admiration. Not yet. The uneasy sensation of seeing a category fail in real time. June Mercer was not showing off. That was the worst part. She was bored. And when bored she fixed things. "Sergeant," Seelan said, "in the future, if you intend to improve the functionality of my station without permission, I would prefer advance notice." June nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds fair." "A beat. Then. You got 2 more bad couplings in C7 and upper vent B12. Malvek turned white enough around the mouth to be noticeable. Seelan said, "You're sure?" June tilted her head as if listening to something none of the rest of them could hear. "Yeah." Malvek ran. Not walked. Ran. June watched him go, then looked back at Seelan. "He's gonna be happier if he finds them before they fail." "Will he?" "No," June said. "But he'll be less surprised. That was the first incident. Not dramatic. Not strategic. But by evening half the station engineering crews knew one of the humans had diagnosed 7 hidden faults while looking for nothing in particular, and the story traveled the way all useful stories traveled in wartime, not through official channels but through low voices, food lines, maintenance logs, and the private mental list everyone kept of what might save their life later. The second sign arrived in the archive room. Dr. Mara Sen had requested every Veyr combat recording the relay possessed, including frontline footage, formation telemetry, drone drift archives, withdrawal sequencing, ceasefire observations, failed coalition prediction models, and the restricted secondary material the coalition had hidden inside anomalous irregulars, because no one liked data that made prior confidence look stupid. She entered the relay archive annex at 0600. At 1730 she was still there. Commander Tal Veyr checked on her twice and each time found the same scene. 3 holoscreens running at different speeds. 1 paper notebook open flat on the desk. 1 second notebook already half full. Untouched. 6 years of war reduced, somehow, to a woman in a gray coat watching patterns nobody else had thought to name. The third time he entered, around midnight, she looked up before he spoke and said, "Your tactical people are asking the wrong kind of question." Tal stopped in the doorway. They are asking how the Veyr move, she continued. They should be asking what makes them need to move that way. Tal stepped closer. You found something. Yes. What? Mara rewound one engagement, then another, then a third from an entirely different sector. Here. On the screen, a Veyr left support line shifted by a fraction. Nothing obvious. Nothing spectacular. Just a narrowing. Then for minutes later, retreat. Tal watched the second clip. Same thing. Then the third. Again. His eyes narrowed. That could be coincidence. 3 times maybe, Mara said. 12 times across 6 years, no. She tapped the hollow display and brought up a layered pattern map of spacing contractions across multiple Veyr engagements. They tightened before retreat. Tal crossed his arms. Meaning, Mara said, their command structure signals uncertainty in body geometry before it signals it in language. He frowned. That sounds like theory. It is theory, she said. Good theory predicts things before tactical reports do. Tal looked at the map again. What are we actually seeing? Mara considered the wording for a second. Fear, she said. He was quiet. That isn't a military term. No, Mara replied. That's why you've all been losing with such elegant consistency. Tal should have been offended. Instead, to his own irritation, he found himself leaning over the table to study the display more closely. Mara pointed to the patterns. The Veyr are excellent at planned war. They are not excellent at the emotional micro-instabilities created when war ceases to fit the plan they expected. Tal looked from the map to her face. And Vale needs to hear this. Yes. He glanced at the unread tea. When did you last eat? She looked honestly surprised by the question. I don't remember. Tal nodded once. I'll bring food. Bring the geology layers too. He paused. Why? Because if their retreat stress shows and formation spacing, I want to know what terrain types correlate with the highest command latency adaptation. He stared at her. You're not treating this like a battle archive. No, Mara said. I'm treating it like an organism under pressure. That was the second incident. Also not dramatic. No shots fired. No fleet movement. No speech to frightened admirals. Just one human scientist finding a hidden seam in 11 years of war because she refused to mistake doctrine for truth. The third sign came from General Oren Vale himself. Admiral Seelan found him alone in Observation Room 9, sitting in the dark with one low-status strip burning along the floor and the Vashari sector rotating silently on the front glass. No notes in his hands. No screens active. No drink. Just stillness. She had begun to realize that Vale's stillness was not rest. It was loading. General, she said. He did not look away from the stars. Admiral. Your people have now repaired portions of my relay, insulted coalition doctrine, and discovered that the Veyr announced panic with geometry. Yes. She stepped further into the room. One of those things concerns me professionally. The other 2 concern me strategically. That's probably the right balance. She ignored that. You're very calm. Vale gave the faintest shrug. I'm thinking. About the next engagement? Yes. Seelan came to stand beside him at the glass. The Vashari contested band stretched across the display, gray rock, dark orbital lanes, projected fleet movement lines, and the cold patience of a war that had learned to repeat itself. What do you think now? She asked. Vale was quiet for a while. Then. I think the Dominion's biggest strength is that everybody around it has agreed to call its habits inevitable. Seelan turned her head slightly. He went on. They've fought your species and your allies for 11 years. That means 11 years of everyone on your side learning the Veyr's patterns so they can survive them. That's called adaptation. Sure, Vale said. But survival adaptation and victory adaptation aren't the same thing. He finally looked at her. If all your thinking starts inside the enemy's preferred shape, then all your success is rented. That sentence stayed in the room like a new structural element. Seelan said, and what would not rented success look like? Vale looked back out toward the projected war zone. First, he said, it would look stupid. Despite herself, she almost smiled. Why? Because anything that actually breaks a stable losing pattern always looks unreasonable to the people who got good at managing the loss. That was the third sign. And by the time the station's long night cycle began, Admiral Seelan Mar understood the outline of the human unit in a way she had not on the dock. They were not impressive in the usual military sense. They were worse. They were the sort of people who heard faults before systems admitted them, saw behavior before doctrine explained it, and sat in the dark until the shape of the war changed from campaign into problem. Not heroes. Not monsters. Not reinforcements. Not yet soldiers even. Something else. Something the Veyr had not yet been asked to classify. And somewhere beneath that thought, colder and more useful than fear, Seelan felt the first stirrings of hope she did not trust enough to name. The Veyr fleet appeared on the tactical glass exactly where Coalition models said it would. That was the problem. Admiral Seelan Mar stood in Tactical Room 2 with General Oren Vale on her right, Dr. Mara Sen on his right, and 32 Coalition officers arranged in a wide crescent behind them, each one carrying the particular stillness of people about to watch their own confidence tested in public. The tactical display filled the wall from floor to ceiling. Vashari Four turning slowly below them in muted gray. The broken curve of the moon's thermal vent systems. Coalition approach vectors in blue. Veyr fortification arcs in red. Estimated drone screens in pale gold. Fallback routes in white. Casualty projections in a harsh yellow band along the lower edge. Seelan hated the yellow band. It made death look administrative. Commander Tal Veyr stood at the side console with his hands folded behind his back while one of the Coalition tactical officers, Senior Strategist Halden, stepped forward to begin. The Dominion position on Vashari 4 has held for 19 days, Halden said. Their command geometry remains stable. Their right defense spine anchors the thermal approach corridor. Their central artillery nests cover the two standard insertion lanes. Their left support line protects the relay depression and has shown no meaningful weakness under sustained pressure. General Vale did not react. Halden continued with the careful confidence of a man who had built this plan with enough revisions to believe at least some of it must now count as wisdom. Coalition recommendation is a three-wave strike. First wave draws fire and fixes their central attention. Second wave shifts left, compresses the support line, and forces drone redirection. Third wave exploits the supply trench on delayed timing and breaks the relay corridor once the Veyr command structure reallocates. He paused and gestured toward the lower band. Projected Coalition casualties, 34%. No one in the room visibly liked that number. No one visibly found it unacceptable either. That, Seelan thought, was the oldest sickness in long wars. You did not need to love a cost. You only had to learn how to stand beside it without flinching. Halden finished. The tactical AI has run this engagement 1,100 times. Within known combat variables, this is our highest probability path to position collapse. Silence. Not empty. Waiting. Every eye in the room slid, eventually toward Oren Vale. He had asked for the full battle geometry. Now the room wanted to know whether the human who had arrived asking different questions intended to break their best answer in half. Vale sat at the table for 3 more seconds without speaking. Then he reached forward, tapped the console, and froze the tactical model mid-projection. "We are not doing that," he said. No raised voice. No drama. Just a sentence placed on the table like a loaded tool. Strategist Halden blinked. "General, with respect." Vale looked at the projected casualty band. "That word," he said, "acceptable. You people use it too much." The room tightened. Halden drew himself up slightly. 34% losses in exchange for a strategic corridor break are within war-compliant coalition thresholds. Vale nodded once. Sure. That single word somehow contained total rejection. He stood, stepped to the display, and without asking permission put one hand into the holographic projection itself. The coalition officers noticed that more than they should have. Not because there was a rule against it. Because there was a culture against it. Coalition strategy rooms liked sequence. Vale had just chosen contact. He marked the red central arc. "If you hit here like this," he said, "you're giving them the exact war they trained for." Halden answered immediately. "It is the only viable war on that terrain." Dr. Marason spoke for the first time in 12 minutes. "No," she said. "It's the only viable war if you believe the terrain is the important part." Several heads turned toward her. Vale didn't. He had already expected the line. "Good." Seelan filed that too. Halden's voice sharpened. "Doctor, this is a combat geometry problem." Mara stepped forward, one notebook still in hand. "No," she said calmly. "It's a cognition problem wearing a combat geometry costume." That bought her silence. She pointed to the left support line. "Here." On the display, a dozen past engagements flickered into being in ghost overlays. Different sectors, different scales, same species, same pattern. The Veyr tightened the support spacing approximately 4 minutes before formal retreat in every engagement where uncertainty exceeds command confidence. Halden frowned. We've already heard this. No, Mara said. You've heard the observation. You haven't heard the implication. She tapped again. The overlay synced. The room watched the same tiny tightening appear over and over. Barely visible. Never officially flagged. Always preceding break. Mara looked at the room, not the display. They do not retreat because pressure becomes mathematically unfavorable. They retreat because their internal confidence structure starts collapsing before they can narrate the reason in command language. Strategist Halden crossed his arms. That is still not a battle plan. No, Vale said from beside the display. It's what battle plans are made of. He shifted the projection to the south side of the Veyr position and highlighted a long, curving depression in the moon's rock. It glowed pale on the display. Unspectacular. Ugly. Wrong. The terrain file identified it immediately. Thermal vent basin C9 unstable subsurface / unsuitable for troop movement. Vale pointed at it. What about that? The room almost laughed. Almost. Halden didn't bother hiding his contempt. That basin is geologically unstable. No serious military planner would attempt insertion through it. Vale turned his head slightly. Says who? Halden gestured toward the wall as if the whole accumulated body of coalition military doctrine stood there to answer on his behalf. The survey itself. The physics. June Mercer, who had been silent in the back corner of the room cleaning her fingernails with the same sharpened blade she had absolutely no need to keep sharpening, said, Physics usually depends on where you put your feet. Every eye in the room turned to her. She did not look up. Seelan felt the beginning of a headache behind one eye. Not because June was wrong. Because she was not. Vale looked at Mara. Tell them. Mara opened the notebook and flipped to a page already marked. If something hits the Veyr right flank hard enough, fast enough, and from a position their model excludes, she said, the left support line will tighten before command rationalizes why. We have the pattern. The lag is consistent. 3 minutes and 40 seconds to 4 minutes and 12, depending on terrain exposure. She tapped the basin. If 6 people come up inside the vent system from here, they will not be entering as a military force in Veyr tactical logic. They will be entering as a classification failure. The room did not like that sentence. It shouldn't. Halden said, unsuitable terrain. No insertion doctrine. No safe extraction corridor. This is not an operation. It is a wager. Vale turned from the display fully now. He had that irritatingly calm look again, the one that made junior officers feel like he had already lived through their objection and was merely waiting for them to catch up. All war is a wager, he said. The only question is whether you're betting on something the other guy expects. That landed. Art. Because everyone in the room knew the answer. For 11 years the coalition had been betting on predictability against a species that weaponized orderly response. Seelan stepped closer to the table. You can get a team through that basin? June finally looked up. Sure. Halden stared at her. That terrain would kill a full insertion unit. June shrugged. Then don't send a full insertion unit. Seelan looked at Vale. How many? 6. That's all? For the first question, he said. Yes. The phrase pulled the room up short. Not the assault. Not the operation. The first question. Seelan understood before anyone else in the room did, and the understanding was cold enough to be useful. Vale was not proposing a battle. He was proposing an inquiry with explosives. She looked at Mara. And once the right flank reacts? Mara turned the page. Then the left flank tightens. At 4 minutes, your coalition wave hits the support line at the exact moment their command confidence fractures but before the retreat order formalizes. You won't be fighting their stable formation. You'll be hitting the moment the stable formation becomes a lie. Commander Tal Veyr said quietly, you want us to attack the hesitation. Vale nodded. Exactly. No one spoke for a long moment. Then strategist Halden said, in the tone of a man trying one last time to rescue the dignity of the old world before the new one walked over it, this has not been modeled. Vale took a ration bar from his coat pocket, opened it and bit into it with maddening calm. No, he said after swallowing. That's the point. The room broke then. Not into chaos. Into argument. Coalition officers objected from every angle. Geological instability. Insertion survivability. Command exposure. Lack of precedent. Non-compliance with modeled war paths. Moral hazard of improvised vectoring. Uncertainty layering. Unacceptable unpredictability. Vale spent most of the next 40 minutes eating the ration bar and reading the geological survey data on a side tablet while everyone else tried to explain why doing the thing the enemy had not prepared for felt irresponsible. Mara answered only when needed. June watched the route projection as if she were already walking it in her head. Veyr gradually stopped arguing and started listening. Admiral Seelan Mar said very little. She had noticed something important. The coalition officers were defending the three-wave plan not because they loved it, but because it belonged to a category that let them remain respectable if it failed. Vale's plan did not offer that comfort. If it worked, it would work for reasons they had not built. If it failed, no doctrine would catch them when they fell. At the end of the argument, people did not stop because consensus arrived. They stopped because they ran out of new ways to repeat fear in procedural language. General Oren Vale set down the last piece of the ration bar wrapper, looked up from the geology file and said, "All right." That alone quieted the room more effectively than any command bark could have. He pointed at the basin route. June leads the insertion team through C9. Single file. Slow. No heavy loadouts. No one who can't think with their feet. Then at Mara. Mara tracks the spacing shift and calls the 4-minute break. Then at Seelan. You hold your left wave strike until my people make the Veyr ask the wrong question. Strategist Halden opened his mouth. Vale cut him off without looking at him. If you hit them with something they understand, they'll respond with the war they've been winning for 11 years. Now he did look at him. We are not here to improve that war. Silence. Then Admiral Seelan Mar said the thing that made it real. Approved. The room turned toward her. Halden went pale. Admiral? Approved, she repeated. No louder. This time final. She stepped up beside Vale and looked at the projection not as a coalition admiral defending respectable process, but as a commander who had spent 11 months watching people die in formations tidy enough to satisfy committee review. General, she said, if this works? Vale folded the empty wrapper once and slipped it into his coat. It will. Seelan almost smiled despite herself. Arrogant answer. Infuriating answer. And somehow, in that room, with the Veyr positions glowing red and stable on the glass and every coalition model already old in her bones, it felt less like arrogance than a different relationship to uncertainty than anyone else there had ever been allowed to practice. At last June Mercer stood, slid the folding blade shut and tucked it away. When do we go? Vale looked at the room. At the map. At Mara. At the basin route. At the left support line waiting to tighten like a throat around its own fear. Then he said, tonight. And for the first time in 11 years of war, the coalition planning chamber stopped looking like a place where losses were arranged and started looking like a place where the enemy might actually become surprised. The insertion began at 0200 station time. No speech. No ceremony. No dramatic walk to the shuttles under red lights while someone said something memorable enough to be carved into memorial stone later. General Oren Vale hated that sort of thing, and Admiral Seelan Mar had long ago stopped trusting operations that needed to feel important before they were useful. So the 6 of them boarded in silence. June Mercer went first because everyone already knew she would. Behind her came Sergeant Ilian Rowe, broad and quiet and built like an equipment crate that had learned how to walk. Then Corporal Seema Valles, whose field specialty officially read route stabilization and unofficially meant she could convince ugly terrain to tolerate human feet for slightly longer than nature intended. After them came Harker, Finn, and Moss, 3 more wrong-shaped humans chosen not because they looked impressive on a roster, but because General Vale had spent less than a minute on each file and, in that time, decided they were the kind of people who would keep moving when the route became insulting. From Tactical Room 2 aboard Carthan Relay, Seelan watched their biosigns blink into existence across the command glass as 6 small blue markers detached from the coalition baseline and slid toward thermal vent basin C9. The basin looked worse at night. Gray-black ridges, unstable crust plates, intermittent venting, and long narrow seams where the moon's heat rose through cracked mineral beds and made the whole depression seem to breathe like something asleep and unhealthy. Coalition doctrine was right about one thing at least. No sane army would try to use it. That was what made it a rout. Beside Seelan, Dr. Mara Sen stood with one notebook open and 3 layers of Veyr formation telemetry moving across her screen. At the center of the room, General Vale sat down with a cup of coffee and said, "Begin." He said it the same way some men say pass the salt. June's voice came over the comm. Mercer actual. Entering basin. No tension. No performance. Just fact. The blue markers moved. Slowly at first. Single file exactly as planned. Every step tested before weight committed. The thermal basin was not terrain in the normal military sense. It was a negotiation between gravity, heat, brittle stone, and whether the moon felt like remaining polite for another 3 seconds. June was very good at rude terrain. Seelan watched the route track update in tiny increments across the tactical display. Every few seconds the coalition AI attempted to classify what the team was doing. Twice it flagged the movement as inadvisable lateral infiltration. Once it upgraded the warning to path viability below doctrine threshold. By the 12th minute it simply began throwing probability bands at the screen like an irritated bureaucrat. Commander Veyr noticed first. The AI doesn't know what category to put them in. General Vale sipped his coffee. It'll catch up. Mara did not look up from her telemetry. No, she said. It won't. That answer sat in the room. Seelan glanced at her. Why not? Mara finally lifted her eyes. Because the category it wants is not one it's ever been allowed to use for live combat movement. Tal frowned slightly. What category? Mara checked the side console then almost smiled. It keeps generating path of last resort and deleting it. For 1 second, despite everything, something like laughter moved at the edge of tactical room 2. Then June's marker dropped abruptly 6 meters. Every sound in the room stopped. The comms stayed silent for 1 terrible second. Then June said, "That was ugly." Still here. General Vale did not move. Seelan realized, not for the first time, that his stillness was not indifference. It was discipline so complete it did not waste body language on fear unless fear had tactical value. "Report," he said. Surface lip gave under row. Basin shelf still passable. "We've shifted 3 meters east. Keep the map honest." Tal exhaled softly through his nose. One of the coalition tactical officers muttered, "No formation is worth this." General Vale looked at the map. "Good thing this isn't a formation." The team kept moving. By 0316 they were inside the vent system. The southern ridge of the Veyr position rose above them in layered defense arcs of clean, precise geometry. Sensor drones, perimeter watchers, thermal monitors, fallback trenches, pressure-linked support nodes. The Veyr didn't defend like improvisers. They defended like people who believed reality should be courteous enough to arrive through the correct entrances. June Mercer's team had just declined the invitation. Seelan shifted her attention to the upper display. The Veyr command position on Vashari 4 remained exactly as coalition models predicted. Central line stable. Support spacing consistent. Drone sweeps timed. No sign yet that 6 humans were crawling through a section of the moon the Veyr had formally categorized as tactically irrelevant. That last part, Seelan thought, had become humanity's favorite doorway. General Vale set down his coffee. "Range?" Tal answered. 500 meters to right flank thermal nests. "Time?" Mara checked the team velocity, the terrain crawl rate, and the Veyr drone intervals in one glance. 14 minutes if the basin stays cooperative. June cut and over comms immediately. "It won't." No one in the room was surprised. "Updated estimate?" Mara asked. 16 if we stay lucky. 20 if luck leaves. General Vale nodded once, though June couldn't see it. "Take 16. The first Veyr sensor contact came at 0332. A drone sweep clipped the outer edge of the vent system and returned a partial anomaly spike, too low to trigger a full alert, but enough that the right flank shifted 2 monitoring drones inward by half a degree. Mara saw it instantly. First adjustment. Seelan stepped closer to the display. "That's not enough to matter." "It's enough to start the wrong thought," Mara said. That was when Seelan fully understood how differently the humans were fighting this war. Coalition doctrine wanted threshold events. The humans wanted thought shapes. The first explosive charge hit the Veyr right flank at 0341. Not a bombardment. Not a broad assault. A shaped strike inside the southern vent mouth that blew out a sensor cluster, collapsed part of a logistics conduit, and sent a plume of heated debris through a section of the defensive line that had never expected contact from beneath. The Veyr responded fast. To their credit, very fast. Within seconds. Drones reoriented. Thermal guns swung south. Command ping spiked. Reserve units shifted 1 line over. On the coalition screens, the elegant red formation bent but did not break. Strategist Halden, standing stiff-backed in the rear observation line, said, "They're holding." General Vale said, "For now." June's team was already moving again. The first strike had never been meant to win. It was there to ask the Veyr an impossible question. What is this? And because it came from a route the Veyr had excluded from tactical reality, the first answer they built was wrong. Mara's fingers moved across her telemetry board. "Watch the left." Seelan watched. At first she saw nothing. Then tiny. Fractional. But there. The left support spacing contracted by less than a degree. Again, Mara said softly. 30 seconds later it did. Then once more. 3 small tightenings rippling through the line as the Veyr command network processed a right flank intrusion that did not belong to any warfare category it knew how to absorb. Tal leaned toward the display. They're doing it. Mara did not look up. Not yet. This is stress. I want fear. At 0344, June hit the second objective. A second impossible contact. Different pattern. Different angle. One of her team planted a shaped thermal burst against a relay spine while another triggered decoy movement farther upslope, just enough to suggest either a larger force or a stupider one. General Vale watched the right flank bend again. There it was. The left support line tightened visibly now. No doctrine could hide it. No command delay could smooth it out. The Veyr were still fighting well. But beneath the fighting, the geometry of their confidence had begun to close inward around itself. Mara lifted her head. 3 minutes 40. General Vale was already standing. He keyed the coalition assault channel. Admiral. Seelan met his eyes. This was the point where 11 years of coalition war doctrine either remained intact or became historical decoration. She touched the command console. All blue groups, she said. Prepare wave strike left on human mark. Strategist Halden actually took one involuntary step forward. Admiral, that's early. No, she said. It's right. General Vale said into the strike channel, move. The coalition left wave force hit at exactly 0348. Not on the old 3-wave timing. Not after a respectable prolonged exchange. At the precise moment the Veyr left support line was still trying to pretend it had not already begun to doubt itself. The effect was immediate. Not cinematic. Worse. Mathematical. One support cluster overcorrected. A drone net collapsed inward too fast. A command relay sent retreat architecture before retreat language. The left line broke not because coalition fire was overwhelming, but because the Veyr reached the moment Mara had named 4 days earlier, the point where uncertainty arrived faster than command identity could metabolize it. Tel said almost under his breath, "My God." General Vale did not say anything. He just watched the map. On the battlefield, June's team came up out of the vent system fully inside Veyr perimeter logic now, not physically but psychologically. They no longer existed as a weird anomaly. They existed as a failure the enemy had not planned the correct word for. That was enough. By 0407 the Veyr right flank was in full retrograde. By 0419 the supply trench had been abandoned. By 0532 Vashari Four, projected to hold for at least 3 weeks under coalition assault, was coalition held. Coalition casualties, 3 wounded. None critical. No one in tactical room 2 moved for several seconds after the final numbers resolved. The room was too experienced to celebrate quickly. That was not what had happened here. A position had not merely fallen. A whole model of war had just been proven local. Strategist Halden looked at the casualty line like a man waiting for hidden numbers to appear out of shame. They should be higher, he said. No, Mara replied. Your expectations should. That shut him up completely. An hour later, the first Veyr transmission arrived. Not to coalition command. Not through formal ceasefire protocol. Not through any of the dignified channels 11 years of war had built to make slaughter seem civilized. It came as a direct coded inquiry intercepted on an emergency analytic band and brought in person to Admiral Seelan Mar. She read it once. Then a second time. Then she handed it to General Vale. The translated text was short. These are not coalition forces. Escalate classification. Vale read it. Set the slate down. Looked at it for another moment. Then he looked toward June Mercer, who was sitting on an equipment case with one boot off, rotating her ankle like somebody checking a machine part for hidden complaints. Mercer. She glanced up. Yeah. He did not say anything else. He didn't need to. June reached down, picked up the boot and started putting it back on. Oh, she said. That's fine. The phrase was absurd enough that several coalition officers just stared at her. Admiral Seelan Mar looked from the Veyr message to the humans spread around the room. Vale already thinking ahead. Mara rereading telemetry instead of enjoying vindication. June tying her boot as if enemy reclassification were just another maintenance issue. The others resetting gear, checking routes, measuring what came next. Not one of them looked triumphant. That, somehow, was the most unsettling thing of all. The Veyr had not asked who attacked them, how many there were, or what coalition unit had been reassigned. They had asked the only question left when old categories fail. What are those? And for the first time in 11 years of war, Admiral Seelan Mar realized the enemy was no longer trying to defeat a force. It was trying to invent a word. After Vashari Four, the war did not explode. It tilted. That was what made it dangerous. Coalition officers had spent 11 years waiting for a grand turning point because military cultures loved the kind of history that arrived with banners, speeches, and a single battle everyone could point to later as the day the tide turned. The Veyr Dominion did not give them that. The humans didn't either. What happened instead was worse for anyone trying to model it and far better for anyone tired of burying people under mathematically acceptable losses. The war changed shape one engagement at a time. And every time the Veyr adjusted to the last human answer, General Oren Vale made sure the next question looked different. The second engagement came at Keth Moru Relay. 6 days after Vashari Four, Coalition long-range observers flagged a Veyr reinforcement push toward the relay corridor. Heavy formation integrity, textbook command spacing, disciplined progression, every movement so clean it looked almost ceremonial. Admiral Seelan Mar watched the tactical build with the same bitter familiarity she had carried for months. This was how the Dominion usually repaired uncertainty. Not with improvisation. With order. They advanced like a species trying to erase embarrassment by becoming more themselves. General Vale watched the display for 12 seconds. Then he said, "Good. They learned the wrong lesson." Strategist Halden, now quieter than he had been before Vashari Four but not yet wise enough to stop looking offended by new physics, asked, "Wrong how?" Vale pointed at the reinforcement screen. "They think the problem was route violation." Mara Sen, already cross-referencing 3 prior Veyr formation responses on a side console, answered before Vale did. "They're hardening physical assumptions," she said. "Not cognitive ones." Halden frowned. "That distinction is academic while ships are firing." "No," Mara said. "That distinction is why your ships keep firing for months after they should have stopped needing to." Seelan almost pitted him. Almost. By now even the coalition officers who disliked Mara had learned the cost of interrupting her when she was already seeing one layer deeper than the room. Vale marked the relay corridor. "Hit them from expected space," he said. "But change the order of meaning." Tal Veyr, standing beside the operations table, asked, "Translate." Vale glanced at him. "Make the first move look standard enough that they relax into the model they just built. Then break the model in the second motion before they've finished rewarding themselves for being correct." That was classic human battlefield language now, Seelan realized. Not, "Hold this ridge. Break that line. Win this corridor." But, "Alter what the enemy thinks this means. Then hit the thought before it stabilizes." The engagement lasted 7 hours. At the end of it, Keth Moru held. Coalition casualties were 9 wounded, 1 dead. Veyr command spacing on the withdrawal telemetry showed not one contraction pattern this time, but 3 different micro-instabilities arriving in overlapping sequence, as if the enemy had become briefly uncertain which category of fear it was currently feeling. Mara watched the post-battle data scroll past and said almost to herself, "They're learning to distrust their first answer." General Vale, drinking station coffee that had somehow become his preferred punishment, said, "Good." Admiral Mar looked at him. "Why good?" "Because once a system stops trusting the first answer, everything takes longer." The sentence chilled her because she knew immediately that he was right. The Veyr had not just been winning with superior discipline. They had been winning with speed of certainty. Humans were beginning to corrode that. Then came the Vashari corridor. Then Thalen cut. Then the relay edge at Morast Vein, which Coalition Command had quietly stopped pretending it would ever retake before the humans arrived. Each engagement taught the same lesson in a different accent. At Vashari corridor, Vale changed timing. At Thalen cut, he changed visibility. At Morast Vein, he changed the scale of the threat without changing the threat itself, which somehow proved even more devastating because the Veyr had spent the whole battle waiting for escalation that never came while the actual pressure worked quietly somewhere else. Every time the Dominion recalibrated, the humans moved one piece sideways. Not all the pieces, just one. That was what made the effect cumulative. A stupid enemy would have broken quickly. A rigid one might have shattered gloriously. The Veyr did neither. They adapted. That was the horror and the beauty of them. They learned fast, held formation under pain, rebuilt coherence, corrected errors and returned sharper. But every correction assumed the battlefield would pause long enough for the correction to matter. Vale never allowed that pause. Mara mapped it from the relay's deep archive room, which by now everyone had given up pretending belonged to anyone else. No one had formally reassigned the room. They had simply stopped entering it without asking. Screens filled the walls. Paper notes spread across the tables. Past Veyr engagements were stacked beside new ones in color-coded patterns that only Mara could fully read and at this point, only General Vale fully trusted. Admiral Seelan visited the room on the 18th day after Vashari Four and found Mara sitting cross-legged on a chair, shoes off, 2 pens behind one ear, and 7 battle maps layered across the center hollow. "You haven't slept," Seelan said. Mara did not look up. "I have. Not recently. That is not the same thing." "No." Seelan stepped closer. The layered maps showed Veyr adaptation traces, not just formations but the shape of decision-making itself. Mara pointed without preamble. "Here." Seelan followed the line of her finger. "This is their recalibration window. It used to be singular. A battle would break their model in one place, they'd rebuild, and the next engagement would start from restored coherence." She touched 3 separate engagement traces. "Now it's branching. They're trying to hold multiple possible models active at once." "That sounds useful." "It is," Mara said. "For us." She turned finally, eyes ringed with fatigue and lit by the kind of relentless intellectual focus Seelan had only seen in surgeons and zealots. A system that has to maintain 3 possible interpretations of reality reacts slower than a system that only trusts one. Seelan looked back at the maps. "And they've never had to do that before." "No. Because no one made them." Mara nodded once. "That's why this is working." Seelan was quiet for a long moment. "Then, what are we doing to them really?" Mara did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was softer than usual. "We're forcing them to spend thought they used to get for free." That line stayed with Seelan. Because it explained everything. The Veyr had always looked unstoppable because so much of their war-making had been automatic, cultural certainty hardened into doctrine, doctrine hardened into reflex, reflex hardened into civilization. Humans had not beaten that by overpowering it. They had begun charging interest. The coalition officers noticed the change too, though fewer of them had the language for it. The arguments in Tactical Room 2 grew shorter after every engagement. Not because coalition command became more humble. Because outcomes kept killing objections before they fully stood up. Strategist Halden, once the loudest defender of respectable losing, now mostly asked timing questions and looked privately ill whenever a human answer turned out to be right for reasons no model had formally approved. Commander Tal Veyr adapted fastest. By the end of the 3rd post-Vashari engagement, he had stopped asking whether the human plan fit coalition doctrine and started asking what behavior shape Vale was trying to force this time. That was how you knew the war had truly changed. Even the coalition had begun thinking in questions instead of fronts. The Veyr noticed too. Of course they did. They were not fools. Their intercepted command traffic became faster, denser, and less elegant. That last part mattered most. For 11 years, Veyr military communication had been admired, even by enemies, for its clarity. Clean tasking. Minimal ambiguity. Purpose arriving in straight lines. Now Dr. Mara Sen began flagging strange growths in their signal structures. Repeated clarification requests. Redundant command packets. Local leaders over-confirming obvious instructions. Drone spacing corrections issued for conditions that no longer existed by the time the correction arrived. Not panic. Not yet. But strain. The first direct Veyr note after Vashari Four had asked what the humans were. The second, intercepted 2 weeks later after Morast Vane, was shorter. These forces do not hold shape. Model failure persists. Request new classification. Admiral Mar read it in silence. Then handed it to General Vale. He read it once, set it down, and said, "They need time." Mara, half asleep over a stack of behavior traces, answered without lifting her head. "For a species that hasn't needed a new category in 200 years? Vale looked at the signal message. "How long?" Mara's eyes opened. "Not long enough." That, Seelan thought later, was the true cruelty of the human method. They did not simply beat the enemy inside the old war. They changed faster than the enemy could build a word for what was happening. By the time the fighting shifted toward the Heartline worlds, even the coalition civilians had begun speaking differently. Not aloud in the formal councils. Never there. But in hallways. In mess lines. In maintenance spines. In the low traffic between overworked people who no longer trusted their own assumptions about who had come to save them. They had stopped saying, "The Earth Detachment. The Auxiliary Force. The Human Volunteers." Now they said things like, "Vale's people. The problem solvers. Those 13. Don't let them leave yet." Admiral Seelan heard a signals clerk on lower deck whisper to another that the humans didn't fight wars, they made the war realize it had been asked the wrong question. She kept walking after hearing it. but she wrote the line down later. It was too accurate not to keep. The Heartline briefing came on day 28. 3 worlds at the edge of the Vashari system. If they fell, coalition space would not break immediately, but it would begin learning the shape of being cut in two. The Veyr had been moving toward the Heartline for 8 months. Patient, methodical, certain. This was what 11-year wars did when left uninterrupted. They grew roots. The Coalition Council handed operational command of the defense to General Oren Vale. The room did not object. That was how complete the shift had become. No speeches. No offended prestige. No old admirals standing to defend institutional dignity. Just a silent understanding that whatever category this had become, the humans were already farther inside it than anyone else. Vale accepted command the way he accepted coffee, without gratitude performance because gratitude had nothing to do with utility. He sat down at the planning table and said, "I need 6 hours and I need Mara in the room." No one argued. Good. They were learning. Mara took the seat beside him without looking at anyone. General Vale brought up the 7 major Heartline approach vectors. Coalition officers expected a battle plan. Admiral Mar knew better now. She looked at the screens, at the branching routes, at the Veyr massing patterns, at Mara's layered behavior maps, at the quiet set of Vale's shoulders, and understood before anyone said it aloud. They were not about to plan a defense. They were about to build a trap. Not made of terrain. Not made of munitions. Made of behavior. And for the first time since the war began, Admiral Seelan Mar felt a grim, almost shameful certainty settle inside her. The Veyr were about to lose not because the Coalition had finally found better weapons, but because humanity had finally found the seam in the enemy's mind and was about to pull. The Heartline worlds were still there at dawn. That fact alone changed the room. For 8 months the Coalition had spoken about the Heartline in the language people used when they were trying not to admit they had already started mourning something. Not lost. Not yet. But moving toward loss with enough momentum that only a liar or a junior officer still called it uncertain. 3 worlds. 3 linked supply arcs. 3 bright points on every strategic map that meant, in practice, if these go, everything downstream starts learning fear. The Veyr had been pushing toward them for 8 months with the same patient certainty they brought to everything. No hurry. No theatrics. No wasted motion. No visible doubt. Then General Oren Vale and Dr. Mara Sen took command of the defense and in 6 hours, built something that was not a battle plan at all. They built a situation the Veyr could not hold still long enough to understand. 7 simultaneous actions. 7 different pressures. 7 different shapes of threat. Not because 7 was elegant. Because 7 was one more than the Veyr command lattice could properly classify at once without slowing the part of itself that usually made war look effortless. Admiral Seelan Mar stood in Tactical Room 2 while the plan unfolded across half a dozen overlays and felt, for the first time in her career, that she was no longer watching strategy in the Coalition sense. Coalition strategy arranged force. Vale arranged questions. The first pressure point hit the outer relay shell at 0304. The second arrived along a supply lane and then pretended to be retreat. The third wasn't an assault at all, but a logistics failure the Veyr interpreted as sabotage. The fourth was June Mercer and 5 others appearing where no military model on either side thought a human team should physically fit. The 5th and 6th were enough alike to look related until the 7th made that assumption lethal. By minute 19, the Veyr command spacing was no longer elegant. By minute 23, 3 separate fallback doctrines had been triggered in different sectors of the same battlefield. By minute 28, Coalition tactical software had given up trying to produce a stable visual prediction and started updating so fast the display looked like it was reconsidering its own profession. At minute 31, strategist Halden, who had spent 11 years defending proper war, said aloud in a voice that sounded almost offended by the universe itself, "This is not a military engagement." General Vale, coffee at his elbow and both hands flat on the planning rail, said without looking at him, "No." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. Everyone in the room could already see it. The Veyr were still doing what they had always done. Reform. Recalculate. Preserve coherence. Force reality back into known geometry. The humans were preventing reality from holding still long enough for geometry to matter. That was the trap. Not destruction. Destabilization. Not ambush. Interpretive overload. Mara watched the command spacing patterns arrive in broken clusters across her screens, eyes dry and red from too many hours without proper sleep and too much correctness without proper rest. "Now," she said once, and a Coalition left-line pressure team moved. 3 minutes later she said, "Not yet," and a whole artillery branch held when old doctrine would have fired. 5 minutes after that she said nothing at all, just drew one diagonal line through her notes, and General Vale changed the secondary reinforcement order without asking her to explain. By then nobody in Tactical Room 2 needed the explanations immediately. That was another sign of how much the war had already changed. They trusted the shape before they trusted the language. At hour 18, June Mercer came back through the medical corridor with a burn wrapped along her left forearm and dust from 3 different sectors ground into the knees of her field clothes. The medic assigned to intake said, with professional exhaustion, "You need to sit down." June sat. The medic unwrapped the dressing, hissed through her teeth at the damage and asked, "Pain level?" June stared at the wall directly over the medic's shoulder. "Oh, that's fine," she said. "That's totally fine." The medic looked at Admiral Marr, who happened to be standing in the doorway, and said, "They always talk like this?" Seelan answered before June could. "No," she said. "Only when it's bad." June glanced at her. That almost counted as gratitude. Then she looked back at the blank wall and gave it the kind of attention usually reserved for complicated machinery and bad news, as if concentrating hard enough on something ordinary might keep the rest of the day from settling too fully into her bones. That, Seelan thought, was the first real cost visible in the room. Not death. Not great tragedy. But the reminder that the problem solvers were still made of people. Skin that burned. Joints that failed. Hands that shook only later. Minds that kept working long after comfort had left. Mattered. It made the rest of it human again. At hour 19 the Veyr broke contact. Not formally. Not elegantly. Not with a ceasefire request or an announced strategic pause or any of the careful, old, ritualized behaviors 11 years of orderly war had taught both sides to expect. They simply stopped. Not collapsed. Not routed. Stopped. The first intercepted channel came through on an unrecognized line 6 minutes later and was addressed not to Coalition Command, not to Admiral Marr, not to the diplomatic structure that had governed the war for more than a decade. It was addressed to the human detachment. Seelan read it once, then gave it to Vale. Across the room, June was still sitting on the treatment table pulling one boot back on with her good hand. Mara was still reading telemetry with a pen in one hand and someone else's untouched tea cooling beside her. Commander Tal Veyr had gone so still he looked almost ceremonial. General Vale read the message. Set it down. Looked at June. "Mercer." She glanced up. "Yeah." He did not say anything else. June finished pulling on the boot. "Oh," she said. "That's fine." Mara, without lifting her eyes from the signal slate she had already requisitioned from the nearest astonished officer, said, "I know. I'm already reading it." Seelan stepped closer. "What does it say?" Mara read silently for another 5 seconds, then looked up. They would like to discuss terms. No one in the room moved. Because everyone in the room understood the weight of that line. The Veyr had not asked first in 11 years. Not once. They had negotiated. They had paused. They had repositioned. They had accepted mutually survivable bureaucracies around slaughter because civilized species loved wrapping horror in protocol and calling the wrapper progress. But they had never asked first. Now they had. Not because the coalition had finally overpowered them. Because the humans had made continuing the war cognitively more expensive than ending it. Velker Tath, the Vonyi envoy who had come to Earth asking for help and had spent the past month learning that humanity treated categories the way storms treated careful fences, was standing near the side display when Mara translated the request. His skin, which usually moved with slow bands of blue and green and occasional gold, went completely still. Beside him, his younger aide Osveth said quietly, "In 400 years of recorded conflict, they have never done that." "No," Velker said. He looked across the room at the humans. At Vale. At Mara. At June tying her boot. At the others resetting gear, drinking cold coffee, rereading maps, checking field packs. Not like victors, not like heroes, just like workers at the end of a long technical shift. Then Velker said to no one in particular and everyone at once. They did not fight the war. General Vale looked up. Velker finished the thought slowly, as if each word needed to be earned before he let it exist. They solved the problem the war was wearing. The room held that sentence in silence. Because it was true. And because, once spoken, it made the previous 11 years look different in a way nobody was going to enjoy. The negotiation chamber aboard the Vonyi flagship measured crossing was not designed for revelation. It was too clean. Too balanced. Too fond of straight lines and carefully moderated light. Like every diplomatic room built by species who still believed procedure could make pain understandable if you seated it correctly. The Veyr contingent arrived in four-person formation and sat with the defensive composure of a people who had spent centuries treating every room as a structure they might need to survive. The coalition delegation arranged itself opposite. The original plan had placed Admiral Mar at the head, with General Vale representing Earth's field command. That lasted until the Veyr entered, saw Dr. Mara Sen, and altered their spacing by a fraction of a degree that almost no one in the room noticed. Almost. Mara saw it instantly. She leaned toward Vale and said something too low for anyone else to hear. Vale looked at her for 1 second. Then he moved 2 seats to the left. Just like that. No explanation. No discussion. No argument about rank. When the meeting began, it began with Dr. Mara Sen speaking in Veyr. Not the formal military register coalition translators were trained on. Something older. Deeper. Built lower in the throat and slower in the bone. The room went still in the way rooms do when something impossible arrives wearing no special clothes. Admiral Seelan Mar watched the Veyr lead negotiator, Rast Vane, old by his species standards and present at the opening battle of the war 11 years earlier, look at Mara with the careful focus of someone discovering, too late, that one variable in the room had not been listed correctly. They spoke for 20 minutes before any official terms were addressed. No one else in the room understood the exchange completely. Not even Velker's translator disk, which produced half-renders and warning flags as if it were embarrassed by its own limitations. At one point Velker leaned toward Seelan and said quietly, "They are discussing weather." She looked at him. He added, specifically, a storm cycle over the third northern continent of the Veyr homeworld. I do not know why. Neither did she. Not yet. Then the formal negotiation began. Withdrawal corridors. Territorial concession. Silence windows. Non-pursuit agreements. Relay access. Civilian transit protection. And all the other structures that let ending a war feel less like surrender and more like architecture. Mara translated everything. Exactly. No softening. No selective civility. No unnecessary mercy in wording but no cruelty either. At hour 30, Rast Vane stopped speaking in formal register and said something to Mara in the older language. She listened without moving. Her pen stopped. Then she turned to General Vale and said, "He wants to know what humanity wants in exchange for ending this." The room waited. Vale set down his water cup. A junior coalition aide shifted in discomfort at the silence that followed, but no one who mattered interrupted it. At last Vale said, "A straight answer." Mara translated. Rast Vane waited. Vale looked at him with the same patient flatness he had brought to the dock, to the maps, to the battle geometry, to every room where someone else still believed category would save them. Then he asked, "Why did you start the war?" No heat in it. No accusation. No rhetoric. Just the first useful question anyone had apparently asked in 11 years. The Veyr negotiator went completely still. Seelan watched his hands. Folded from the beginning. Precise. Controlled. Now, for the first time since he entered the room, the pressure inside the fold changed. Caught. It was so small most people would never have seen it. She saw it because Mara had taught the room, by the force of repeated correctness, that behavior always leaked before language admitted what it meant. Rast Vane answered for a long time. Mara listened. Then she translated. What emerged was almost insulting in its simplicity. Not grand ideology. Not species hatred. Not ancient destiny. A resource claimed 60 years before the first shot. A border misunderstanding neither side had clarified because clarification would have required admitting uncertainty. Uncertainty became position. Position became pride. Pride became structures. Structures became momentum. Momentum became 11 years of the dead. The room sat with that. Admiral Seelan Mar felt, with cold embarrassment, the whole war reconfigure itself in her head, not simpler but more shameful. Velker Tath was staring at the table now, his skin gone into a deep, slow gold that Seelan had learned meant thought moving painfully. At last the terms were signed. Fair. More than fair in some ways. Much fairer than 11 years had earned. After the Veyr delegation left, General Vale asked Mara quietly what Rast Vane had said to her in the older register before the formal terms began. She capped her pen. Looked at the table for a second. Then answered. He said in 11 years no one asked. That sentence finished the story. Not the war. The story. Because suddenly everything made sense. Why the Veyr had asked for terms. Why they had addressed the humans directly. Why Velker could not classify what Earth had sent. Why coalition strategy had kept producing survivable failure. Why Mara had insisted behavior mattered before doctrine. Why Vale had asked in the dock whether they wanted soldiers or results. They had not needed better fighters. They had needed someone willing to stop treating the war as sacred and start treating it as a badly maintained system everyone was too proud to diagnose honestly. 5 days later, the human detachment left. No ceremony. No medals. No parades in the relay corridors. No self-congratulation. They had never officially been there in the first place. June Mercer slept most of the transit home. General Vale read 2 books about difficult people doing difficult things and then having to live with themselves afterward. Dr. Mara Sen wrote the first pages of a paper that would, in later years, change how 3 civilizations understood conflict initiation and collective behavior, though she did not know that yet. Velker Tath wrote his report 4 times. Each version got shorter. The final version was 2 paragraphs. The second paragraph read in translation. We asked for soldiers. We were given something for which I do not have adequate classification. I recommend the compact remember the distinction. I further recommend we do not forget what asking cost us, nor what answering cost them. He submitted it, turned out the lights in his cabin, and sat in the dark while Earth drew closer 1 kilometer at a time. He had spent the entire campaign trying to decide what exactly he felt about the humans. Not admiration. Not gratitude. Something quieter. The feeling of standing beside a thing you did not fully understand and knowing, with complete certainty, that it was standing exactly where it was supposed to be. Outside the stars held still. They had not asked anything of him. They had nothing left to prove. And Velker Tath understood, finally, that this was the one thing they had in common with humanity. The most consequential things in the galaxy rarely arrived announcing themselves as such. Sometimes they arrived as a patient question. 13 files in the wrong folder. A woman who watched behavior instead of doctrine. A bored sergeant fixing your ship because it annoyed her. Or a general who looked at 11 years of respectable war and refused to call it inevitable. The humans had gone home. The Heartline still had 3 worlds on it. The war was over. And everyone who survived it was left with the same uncomfortable truth. Earth had not sent reinforcements. Earth had sent a species that looked at an 11-year war and, in under a month, decided it was badly designed.